Three young men stood before a blazing furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. The most powerful king in the world had just given them one last chance to save their lives. All they had to do was bow down when the music played, just once, just to survive. But they looked the king in the eyes and said something so bold, so unthinkable, that it would change the course of history. And what they said reveals the exact formula for building courage that can't be shaken, not by threats, not by loss, not by public humiliation, not by anything. Because here's what nobody tells you. You're going to face your own furnace moment. Maybe you're in it right now. That moment when staying faithful costs you something you don't want to lose. That moment when everyone else is bowing and you're the only one still standing. That moment when compromise looks like wisdom and obedience looks like suicide. And in that moment, you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to have the courage to stand firm, or you're going to fold. The difference won't be how brave you are. It'll be whether you know the 21 principles these 3 men knew. Principles that can make you unbreakable in a world that's designed to make you bend. Let me be direct with you. Most of us are building our faith backwards. We think courage is something we'll find when we need it. We imagine that when the pressure comes, we'll somehow discover strength we didn't know we had. And then the test actually arrives, and we crumble, we compromise. We tell ourselves it's just this once. We rationalize why our situation is different, and we walk away wondering why we couldn't stand firm. But here's what most people never figure out. Courage isn't something you find in the crisis. It's something you build long before the crisis arrives. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't suddenly become unshakable at the furnace. They had been building unshakable faith for years, through specific decisions, specific principles, specific habits that most people completely overlook. And that's what these 21 lessons reveal. Not just what happened to 3 guys in the Old Testament, but the exact framework for building the kind of faith that can't be threatened, bought, or intimidated. The kind that makes you immovable when everyone around you is bending. The kind that transforms you from someone who hopes they'll be faithful into someone who knows they will be. Because here's what's at stake. Your next year is going to test you. Your relationships are going to pressure you. Your workplace is going to demand things from you. Culture is going to tell you that God's ways are outdated, and you're going to have to choose. These 21 lessons are the difference between standing and falling. Between becoming someone whose faith is unshakable and becoming another person with good intentions and a history of compromise. So stay with me, because what you're about to learn isn't just interesting, it's the blueprint for the kind of courage you're going to need. And it starts in the most unexpected place. Let's dive right in. Lesson 1. Your identity is formed before the test arrives. The story actually begins years before anyone asked them to bow to a golden statue. Daniel chapter 1 tells us these 3 young men were among the brightest in all of Judah, intelligent, handsome, qualified to serve in the king's palace. But they didn't volunteer for this honor. They were captives, ripped from their homeland, taken to Babylon against their will. Think about what that means. They lost everything familiar. Their families, their homes, their freedom, their future. Everything they thought their life would be was gone in an instant. And yet somewhere in that devastating journey, in that moment when most people would have been consumed by bitterness and fear, they made a decision about who they would be. They decided that even though everything around them had changed, their identity as God's people would not. This wasn't a theological discussion, this was a survival decision. They could either let their circumstances define them, or they could let their covenant with God define them. They chose God. This is the foundation of unshakable courage, settling who you are before anyone asks you to be someone else. Because when the furnace moment comes, you won't have time to figure out your identity. You'll only have time to prove what you've already decided. Most people wait until the test to determine their convictions, and that's why they fail. These 3 men understood that your answer in the storm is determined by who you became in the preparation. You don't become a person of courage in the crisis, you reveal whether you already were one. Lesson 2. Compromise always starts small. When they first arrived in Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar did something that seemed generous. He assigned them royal food and wine from his own table. This wasn't just any food. This was the best Babylon had to offer, the kind of provision that would make most people feel honored, grateful, fortunate even. But there was a problem. The food had likely been offered to idols first, and eating it would violate their covenant with God. Now here's what makes this moment so critical. Nobody would have known if they ate it. Nobody would have judged them. They could have easily rationalized it. They were captives after all. They were far from home. Surely God would understand. Surely survival mattered more than a dietary restriction. Surely this wasn't the hill to die on. But Daniel 1 verse 8 says, they resolved not to defile themselves with the royal food. They said no. This wasn't about food. This was about recognizing that compromise never announces itself with a billboard. It comes dressed as convenience, as flexibility, as wisdom, even. It whispers that this one time won't matter, that it's just a small thing, that you can always correct course later. But these young men understood something we desperately need to grasp. The small compromise is always the test for the big one. When you say yes to what seems harmless, you're training yourself to say yes when the stakes are higher. The food was preparation for the furnace. And because they passed the test no one was watching, they had the strength to pass the test everyone would see. Lesson 3. God honors faithfulness, even when it doesn't make sense. So they made their request to the guard. Let us eat vegetables and drink water instead of the king's food. Just test us for 10 days and see what happens. You can imagine what the guard was thinking. These young men were supposed to be trained for royal service. They needed to look healthy, strong, impressive. And they wanted to eat vegetables? It made no logical sense. It defied all conventional wisdom about nutrition and preparation. It seemed like a recipe for failure. But here's what happened. Daniel 1 verse 15 tells us that after 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than all the young men who ate the royal food. God honored their obedience in a way that defied natural explanation. They didn't compromise, and they didn't suffer for it. In fact, they thrived. They got the outcome everyone else was chasing through compromise, but they got it through faithfulness. This is where trust gets built. When you obey God in something small and watch Him show up in ways that don't make sense, you're not just learning a lesson, you're building a history with Him. You're creating evidence that His ways work even when they seem foolish to everyone else. And that history becomes your ammunition when the big test comes. It's not faith in a concept anymore. It's faith in a God you've watched prove Himself faithful. So when the furnace is in front of you and the king is demanding you bow, you're not guessing whether God will come through. You already know He will, because you've seen Him do it before. And what comes next is where most people's faith would have completely fallen apart. Lesson 4. External pressure will always demand internal compromise. Years passed. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego continued to serve faithfully in Babylon. And then one day, King Nebuchadnezzar built a golden statue, not a small idol tucked away in a temple. A monument 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, covered in gold, towering over the plain of Dura. And he issued a decree that when the music played, every single person had to stop what they were doing and bow down to worship it. Daniel 3 verse 4 says, "The herald announced it to all peoples, nations, and languages." This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't a cultural tradition you could politely decline. This was law backed by the full authority of the empire. And the consequence for disobedience wasn't a fine or imprisonment. It was death by fire in a blazing furnace. Now let's be honest about something. The pressure to conform doesn't always look this dramatic in your life. You're probably not facing a literal golden statue, but the mechanism is exactly the same. It's the expectation to go along with everyone at work, even when it violates your conscience. It's the cultural narratives that make God's standards seem outdated, restrictive, even harmful. It's the relational pressure that says, if you don't bend just a little, you'll lose everything that matters. The statue changes, but the demand stays the same. Bow down to what everyone else is bowing to, or pay the price. And the pressure is always external, but the damage is always internal. Because every time you compromise, you're not just violating God's standards, you're eroding your own identity. Lesson 5. Your convictions will be tested publicly. Here's what made this test even harder. It wasn't private. Daniel 3 verse 7 tells us that when the music played, all the peoples, nations and languages fell down and worshipped the statue. Everyone bowed. Thousands of people from every background imaginable, all hitting the ground at the same moment. And in that sea of bodies, 3 men remained standing. Can you imagine what that felt like? The music is playing. Everyone around you drops to their knees, and you're standing there, alone, exposed, with every eye that dares to look seeing your refusal. This wasn't a quiet moment of obedience in the privacy of your own heart. This was obedience on display, with an audience of thousands and consequences that were very, very public. Most of the time, our convictions get tested exactly this way. It's not when you're alone that it's hardest to follow God, it's when everyone is watching. It's when your choice to obey will be visible, will be talked about, will mark you as different in ways you can't take back. There's the pressure of what people will think, what they'll say behind your back, how they'll treat you tomorrow, how this one decision might cost you friendships, opportunities, respect. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understood something that made them immovable. They weren't performing for the crowd, they were answering to an audience of one. And when you understand that God's opinion is the only one that matters eternally, every other opinion loses its power to control you. Lesson 6. The accusers will always weaponize your faith. It didn't take long for someone to notice. Daniel 3 verse 8 says certain astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews, but notice how they did it. They didn't just report the facts objectively. They made it personal. They made it about power. Verse 12 says they told the king, "There are some Jews you've appointed over Babylon who pay no attention to you. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you've set up." Do you see what they did? They framed faithfulness as rebellion. They made devotion to God look like disrespect to authority. They weaponized the very thing that made these 3 men valuable, their integrity, and turned it into evidence of disloyalty. And this tactic is as old as time and as current as your last conversation with someone who doesn't share your faith. When you stand firm in your convictions, not everyone will simply disagree with you. Some people will make you the villain of the story. They'll twist your obedience into arrogance. They'll call your standards judgmental. They'll frame your faith as the problem, as the thing that's causing division, as the reason things are uncomfortable. They'll take your kindest intentions and reinterpret them through the worst possible lens. Expect it, because if it happened to 3 men who were just trying to honor God quietly, it will happen to you. And don't let their narrative become your fear. Don't let their accusations make you question whether obedience is worth it. The people who weaponize your faith are often the same people who benefit from your compromise. But here's where the story reveals something about human nature that we all need to understand. Lesson 7. Anger is the weapon of those who can't control you. Daniel 3 verse 13 says, "When Nebuchadnezzar heard the report, he was furious with rage." Let that sink in for a moment. He was the most powerful man in the known world. He had armies, wealth, absolute authority over millions of people, and he was consumed with rage because 3 young captives wouldn't bow to his statue. Why? Because he couldn't control them. He had their bodies. He could command where they worked, where they lived, what they did every day, but he couldn't control their worship. He couldn't force them to give him what they had reserved for God alone. And that lack of control enraged him. This is what you need to see. When people get angry at your obedience to God, it's almost never really about your obedience. It's about their inability to control you. They can't manipulate you into compromising. They can't use fear or pressure or social consequences to make you bend. And that threatens them because it exposes the limits of their power. Anger is the last resort of people who are used to getting their way. It's the sound of someone realizing they don't have leverage over you. And here's what's fascinating: the angrier they get, the more you know you're doing something right. Because if your faithfulness didn't threaten their system, they wouldn't care. Don't let their anger become your fear. Don't let their rage make you question whether you should have just gone along. Anger is often just the weapon of those who've lost control, and your job isn't to give them back that control. Lesson 8. You'll be given one more chance to conform. So Nebuchadnezzar brought them before him, and he did something interesting. He gave them another opportunity. Daniel 3 verse 14 to 15 records his words. He asked them if it was true that they didn't serve his gods or worship his statue. And then he said, "Now when you hear the music, if you're ready to bow down, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace." And then he asked the question that reveals the heart of every system that demands your allegiance. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? This is the lie behind every threat. The world wants you to believe that if you don't compromise, you're on your own, that obedience equals isolation, that faithfulness equals loss, that if you don't bow to what everyone else is bowing to, you'll be destroyed and no one, not even God, will be able to save you. It's the ultimate intimidation tactic, designed to make you feel small, powerless, foolish for even considering defiance. And notice that he gave them time to reconsider. This is how pressure works. It gives you just enough time to doubt yourself, just enough space to question whether your convictions are really worth it. Just enough room to convince yourself that maybe compromise isn't that bad. But what these three men understood is that the second chance to compromise is often more dangerous than the first, because now you've had time to talk yourself into it. But what these three men said next is one of the most powerful statements of faith ever recorded in Scripture. Lesson 9. True faith doesn't negotiate. Daniel 3 verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." Read that again. We do not need to defend ourselves. They didn't argue their case. They didn't try to explain why their convictions were reasonable. They didn't attempt to find middle ground or negotiate terms. They didn't justify their position or make their obedience sound palatable. They simply, clearly, without apology, said no. There's something profoundly powerful about this simplicity. Real conviction doesn't need to defend itself to people who demand compromise. It doesn't waste energy trying to make faithfulness understandable to people who've already decided it's foolish. There's a time for apologetics, for explanation, for helping people understand. But there's also a time when the only appropriate response is a clear, direct, unapologetic no. You don't owe everyone a defense of your obedience to God. You don't have to make your faith palatable to people who are asking you to disobey Him. You don't have to justify why God's ways make sense or explain why you can't just go along. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is simply, "I don't need to defend this. This is who I am. This is what I believe, and I'm not negotiating." Because when you start defending what shouldn't be negotiable, you've already given ground you can't get back. If you're still with me, what they say in the next breath might be the most important sentence in this entire account. Lesson 10. Faith trusts God, even without a guaranteed outcome. Daniel 3 verse 17 to 18. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and He will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. But even if He does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Stop. Read that one more time. Even if He does not. This is where most of our faith breaks down. We obey God because we expect Him to come through. We follow His commands because we believe it will result in blessing, protection, provision, deliverance. We're making a transaction, our obedience for His rescue. But what happens when He doesn't rescue? What happens when you do the right thing and it costs you everything? These three men weren't bargaining with God. They weren't testing Him. They weren't saying, "We'll obey if you save us." They were saying something far more profound. "We believe you can save us, and we believe you will save us. But even if our faith is wrong about the how and the when, we will still not bow. Our obedience isn't dependent on getting the outcome we want. It's dependent on who you are." This is the difference between transactional faith and transformational faith. Transactional faith says, "I'll follow you if you give me what I want." Transformational faith says, "I'll follow you because you're worthy, regardless of what it costs me." One is fragile, the other is unshakable. One crumbles the moment God doesn't perform on demand. The other stands firm because it's rooted in God's character, not his convenience. Lesson 11. Obedience is its own reward. Most of us have been taught to view obedience as an investment. You obey God, and in return, he blesses you. You follow his commands, and your life works out better. You trust him, and he protects you from harm. And while there's truth to the principle that God's ways lead to flourishing, there's a dangerous assumption underneath it that obedience is a means to an end, that you follow God to get something from God. But what if obedience is the end? What if the goal isn't to use God to get a better life, but to honor God because he deserves it? What if faithfulness isn't about what it gets you, but about who it makes you? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't obeying to avoid the fire. They were obeying because God was worth their worship whether he rescued them or not. And that shift changes everything. When your faithfulness is about results, it becomes conditional. It lasts only as long as things are going well. But when your faithfulness is about God's character and your identity in him, it becomes unbreakable. You obey because it's right, not because it's rewarded. You follow him because he's worthy, not because he's useful. And ironically, when you stop treating obedience as a transaction, you often find that God blesses it anyway, not because you earned it, but because that's who he is. Obedience for the sake of obedience is its own reward, because every time you choose God over comfort, you're becoming someone whose faith can't be bought, threatened, or negotiated away. Lesson 12. Your refusal to compromise exposes the violence of the system. Daniel 3 verse 19 says that when Nebuchadnezzar heard their response, he was so furious that his face became distorted with rage. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. 7 times. As if the furnace at normal temperature wasn't deadly enough. Their refusal didn't just anger him, it made him irrational. It revealed the cruelty that was always underneath his demand for allegiance. This is what happens when you refuse to bow. You force the system to show its true face. The king's demand seemed reasonable at first. Just worship the statue, just participate in the cultural moment, just go along to get along. But when they said no, the violent reality behind the invitation was exposed. It was never really optional. It was always comply or die. Your quiet, steady refusal to compromise does something similar. It reveals the true nature of what's asking for your allegiance. When you won't bend, people and systems show you what they really are. Sometimes, the invitation to compromise comes with a smile and reasonable language. But when you decline, you see the coercion that was always there. You see how much anger lies beneath the surface tolerance. You see that what claimed to be about unity was actually about control. And sometimes that's what others need to see. Not your arguments, but your unwillingness to participate and the overreaction that follows. Because when the system reveals its violence in response to simple faithfulness, it loses its moral authority. And that exposure is often the beginning of freedom for others. Lesson 13. Obeying God may cost you everything in the moment. Daniel 3 verse 20-21 says, the king ordered some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace. And they threw them in fully clothed, their robes, trousers, turbans, and all. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't a metaphor. This was real. The fire was real. The heat was real. The soldiers who threw them in, verse 22 says, the flames killed them instantly. That's how hot this furnace was. It killed trained soldiers just from proximity. These three men walked toward that furnace knowing they might die. They weren't shielded from the fear. They weren't exempt from the pain of the moment. Courage doesn't mean you don't feel afraid. It means you obey anyway. It means you walk toward what terrifies you because God is worth more than your safety. And here's what we have to be honest about. There are moments when faithfulness will cost you. It might cost you your comfort, your reputation, your job, your relationships, your security. Obedience doesn't come with a promise that you'll avoid suffering. It comes with a promise that God is with you in it. And in that moment, you have to decide, is He worth it? Is He worth losing what I have? Is He worth facing what I fear? Is He worth walking into fire? These three men decided He was, and they walked into the fire. Because they understood that temporary loss for eternal faithfulness is always the better trade. And then, something happened that no one, not even the king, could have anticipated. Lesson 14. God shows up in the fire, not just after it. Daniel 3 verse 24-25 says, King Nebuchadnezzar suddenly jumped up in amazement. He asked his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" They confirmed. And then he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." 4 men, not 3. Someone else was in the fire with them, and this 4th person didn't look human. He looked divine. They weren't alone. God didn't deliver them from the fire. He joined them in it. This is what we miss when we only pray for rescue. We ask God to take us out of the trial, to remove the difficulty, to spare us from the pain, and sometimes He does. But sometimes the miracle isn't removal, it's presence. Sometimes God's answer isn't, "I'll get you out of this, but I'll go through it with you," and that presence changes everything. Because when you're in the fire and God is standing next to you, the fire stops being about survival and starts being about intimacy. You learn things about God in the furnace that you can't learn anywhere else. You experience His presence in a way that prosperity could never teach you. And you come out knowing Him, not just knowing about Him. So, if you're in a fire right now, a situation that feels unbearable, a loss that's crushing you, a struggle that seems endless, stop praying only for escape. Start looking for His presence. Because He's there. He's always there, and His presence is the miracle you need most. Lesson 15. The fire only burns what doesn't belong. When they finally came out of the furnace, Daniel 3 verse 27 says, the governors, prefects, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their robes weren't scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke. But here's what's fascinating. The fire did burn something. Verse 25 says the 4th man was in the fire with them, and when the king called them out, they walked out unbound. The ropes that tied them were gone. The fire burned the only thing that was restricting them. This is what God does in the furnace. He uses the fire to destroy what doesn't belong. The fear that's been controlling you, the false security you've been clinging to, the need for approval that's been holding you captive, the lies you've believed about yourself. The trial refines you, it removes what's restricting you and leaves behind what's real. The furnace didn't destroy these 3 men, it set them free. So when you're in your trial, pay attention to what's being burned away. What fear is losing its grip? What false identity is being exposed? What comfort are you being forced to release? Because the fire isn't random, God is using it to free you from whatever has been binding you. And when you come out, you'll be more yourself than you've ever been, not because you're stronger, but because you're freer. The furnace reveals who you really are by burning away everything you're not. Lesson 16. Your faithfulness becomes a testimony to a watching world. Daniel 3 verse 28, King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel and rescued His servants." They trusted in Him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. The king who threatened to kill them ended up praising their God. The man who built the golden statue ended up proclaiming the superiority of the God these three men served. Why? Because of what he saw. Because their obedience produced something he couldn't explain, couldn't replicate, couldn't deny. Your faithfulness doesn't just protect your own relationship with God, it becomes a witness to everyone watching. When people see you walk through fire without being consumed, they start asking questions. They want to know what you have that they don't. They want to know why you're still standing when everything should have destroyed you. They want to know what makes you different. And that's when your story stops being just about you and becomes an invitation for others to discover the God who shows up in the fire. You don't have to preach at people. You don't have to argue them into faith. You just have to stand firm. You just have to trust God publicly. You just have to let them see that when you obey him, even when it costs you, he proves himself faithful. And that testimony is more powerful than 1,000 sermons. Because people can argue with your theology, but they can't argue with your transformed life. Lesson 17. God defends those who refuse to defend themselves. Daniel 3 verse 29 says, "The king issued a decree that if anyone said anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they would be cut into pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble." Now, we wouldn't endorse that kind of punishment today, but here's the principle. The same king who was their greatest threat became their greatest defender. When you trust God to defend you instead of defending yourself, he fights battles you couldn't win on your own. He vindicates you in ways you couldn't orchestrate. He turns enemies into advocates and opposition into opportunity. But it requires something incredibly difficult, the willingness to let go of self-protection and trust that God's defense is better than yours. Most of us can't do this. When someone attacks our reputation, we immediately defend ourselves. When someone misrepresents us, we rush to correct the narrative. When someone threatens us, we fight back. But these three men never defended themselves. They never argued their case. They never tried to protect their reputation. They just obeyed and trusted God to handle the rest. And God defended them in a way that was far more complete than anything they could have done themselves. You don't need to protect your reputation. You don't need to make sure everyone knows your side of the story. You don't need to retaliate or manipulate or control the narrative. God will vindicate you in his time. And when he does, it will be so much more powerful than anything you could have done yourself. Lesson 18. Trials elevate those who stand firm. Daniel 3 verse 30. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Their refusal to bow didn't cost them everything. It positioned them for greater influence. Think about that. The very moment that should have ended their lives became the moment that elevated their authority. Faithfulness doesn't always lead to immediate reward, but it always leads somewhere better than compromise ever could. When you refuse to sacrifice your integrity for a shortcut, God opens doors that obedience alone can unlock. The promotion that comes from his hand is worth the wait. The favor that follows faithfulness carries a weight that manipulation and compromise can never produce. Because when God promotes you, he's not just giving you a position, he's validating your character. He's demonstrating to everyone watching that faithfulness pays. He's proving that you don't have to compromise to succeed. Stand firm. The furnace isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning of something greater. Every trial you face is a setup for promotion you can't yet see. Every moment you stand firm when it costs you is building credibility that will open doors later. Every time you choose obedience over advancement, you're positioning yourself for advancement that's actually sustainable, because promotions built on compromise are fragile. But promotions that come from faithfulness are solid. They can't be taken away by the same politics that gave them. They're yours because God said so. And here's what we absolutely cannot overlook as we come to the end of this account. Lesson 19. The furnace reveals who God really is. Before the fire, these three men knew God could deliver them. They had seen him prove faithful with the food. They had watched him honor their obedience in small things. They believed in his power. But after the fire, after walking through flames with a fourth man beside them, after being unbound in a place that should have killed them, they didn't just know about God, they knew God. The trial didn't just test their faith, it deepened their understanding of who God actually is. He's not a distant deity who demands obedience from afar. He's not a transactional God who only shows up when you've earned it. He's the God who walks into the fire with you, who stands beside you in the worst moment of your life, who doesn't just save you from the furnace, but transforms what the furnace means. You'll never know God as sustainer until you need him to sustain you. You'll never know him as provider until you're empty. You'll never know him as comforter until you're broken. You'll never know him as deliverer until you're in something you can't escape on your own. The furnace isn't punishment. It's not even primarily about testing. It's about encountering God in a way you never could without it. It's about discovering dimensions of his character that prosperity keeps hidden. So don't waste your trial. Don't just survive it. Let it introduce you to God in ways you've never known him before. Lesson 20. Your story will outlive you. We're sitting here thousands of years later, still talking about three young men who refused to bow. Their names are still spoken, their courage is still cited. Their moment of faithfulness became a legacy that transcends time, culture, language, and geography. You don't know who's watching your life right now. You don't know whose faith will be strengthened because you didn't compromise when it would have been easier. You don't know which future generation will read about your obedience and find the courage to stand firm in their own furnace. Your obedience matters beyond what you can see. It ripples into the future, into lives you'll never meet, into moments you'll never witness. So stand firm, not just for yourself, but for everyone who will need your example. For the person who's about to give up and needs to see someone who didn't. For the generation that's coming behind you and needs to know that unshakable faith is actually possible. For the child who's watching how you respond to pressure and learning what conviction looks like. For the co-worker who's waiting to see if your faith is real when it costs you something. For the friend who needs to see that following God is worth it even when it's hard. Your story matters, and the ending you're writing right now will echo longer than you can imagine. So make it count. Lesson 21. Jesus is the fourth man in every fire. Here's the most important lesson of all. Daniel 3 verse 25 says the fourth man in the fire looked like a son of the gods. Most biblical scholars believe this was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, a moment when Jesus showed up centuries before Bethlehem to stand with three faithful men in their darkest hour. And if that's true, it changes everything. Because it means the same Jesus who would one day walk into his own furnace on a cross, who would face his own fire for your sake, who would be bound and mocked and killed so that you could be unbound, that Jesus has always been showing up in the fires of his people. You're never alone in your trial because he's already been through the fire for you. He's walked through death itself and come out alive on the other side. And because he did that, you can trust him in every furnace you face. He doesn't ask you to go anywhere. He hasn't already been. He doesn't send you into flames. He wouldn't enter himself. He goes with you. He stands beside you. And he ensures that what's meant to destroy you only refines you. This is why these three men could say, even if he does not, because their faith wasn't ultimately in deliverance from the fire. It was in the presence of God in the fire. And when Jesus is with you, the fire stops being about whether you survive and starts being about who you become. The fourth man in the furnace is the same man who conquered death. And if he's conquered death, he can walk you through anything. So here's what I need you to hear. Courage isn't something you're born with. It's not a personality trait reserved for special people. It's something you build. You build it in the small decisions when no one's watching. You build it in the private moments when it would be easier to compromise. You build it by consistently choosing God's approval over everyone else's. You build it by settling your identity before the test arrives. You build it by recognizing that small compromises lead to big collapses. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't superheroes. They were regular people who made an uncommon decision that God was worth everything. And because they made that choice in the quiet moments, they were ready when the public test came. Because they stood firm over vegetables, they could stand firm before a furnace. Because they built their courage in obscurity, they could display it in crisis. The same courage they had is available to you, not because you're strong enough, but because the God who walked into the fire with them is the same God who walks with you today. The same Jesus who showed up as the fourth man in their furnace is the same Jesus who promises to never leave you or forsake you. And when you understand that, everything changes. The threats lose their power. The pressure loses its grip. The fear loses its control. Because you're not facing anything alone. Your furnace moment is coming. Maybe it's already here. And when it arrives, you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to stand firm or you're going to fold. But now you know the 21 principles that can make you unshakable. You know that courage is built before it's needed. You know that compromise always starts small. You know that God honors faithfulness even when it doesn't make sense. You know that external pressure always demands internal compromise. You know that your convictions will be tested publicly. You know that accusers weaponize your faith. You know that anger is the weapon of those who can't control you. You know that you'll be given one more chance to conform. You know that true faith doesn't negotiate. You know that faith trusts God without a guaranteed outcome. You know that obedience is its own reward. You know that your refusal exposes the violence of the system. You know that obeying God may cost you everything in the moment. You know that God shows up in the fire, not just after it. You know that the fire only burns what doesn't belong. You know that your faithfulness becomes a testimony. You know that God defends those who refuse to defend themselves. You know that trials elevate those who stand firm. You know that the furnace reveals who God really is. You know that your story will outlive you. And you know that Jesus is the fourth man in every fire. So which of these lessons hit you the hardest? Which one do you need to apply right now? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story strengthened your faith today, do me a favor and watch my next video on Daniel, where you'll see how one man's prayer life literally changed an empire and how those same principles can transform your relationship with God starting today. Because if 3 young men could stand firm in Babylon, you can stand firm wherever God has placed you. The courage you need is already available, you just have to build it.